It takes it a while.
I know.
You're
You want to chit
you're
chat?
partially cut off.
Oh, okay. That's what I did last time.
See you.
Okay.
There you go.
That really
Now
helps
you're
to be able to, kind of look over and see what's going on. So yeah, I'm gonna talk to some just through webinar setup and questions and chat box and,
Okay.
okay. Good morning. Good morning. Welcome to our July Federation of Families Parent Webinar. And like, it's just feels like we were in January, just a month or two ago. So here we are in the midst of full on summer. Welcome. Today we have Kim Kane joining us, and she is talking about an issue of suicide, focusing on kind of the teen population and things that parents need to know. It's a tough topic, and I'll be honest, as a parent who now has 3 kids, kind of 20s, mid 20s, I know it's a scary topic, but I also know that with information and understanding what it is you need to look for and really where the red flags are, how to engage your kids, how to have the conversation, is that power is really, knowledge is really powerful when dealing with this topic. And I think it's essential that all parents have kind of some basic understandings of, what are those red flags? When do you need to be concerned? When do you need to bring other people in? And this is definitely an area of expertise for Kim. She's been working for over 15 years in the field of suicidality. She is probably one of the people in the state of Idaho that is most knowledgeable about research, about interventions, about the specifics of our state of Idaho. So I think we're really fortunate that she is here and joining us today and kind of sharing her information with a really specific focus on parents and what do parents need to know as they're talking about this. And also the idea of like share it. The information you hear today, share it with other parents, because I know in the world, my little world that I live in, it is a conversation. So to be able to talk to another parent and say, these are the things that I've heard, or tell them about the webinar and tell them, to check the information themselves. So before we jump into that, those that are on Zoom today, if you have not joined us before, know that there is a section for question and answers. And if there's something you want to specifically ask him, go ahead and stick it in that box, and we will try to get that question to Kim and allow her to answer either during or we'll loop towards the end. There's also a chat box. So if it's not a question, but you want to share a resource, if you have information or just want to make comments, go ahead and put that into the chat box, and then people can kind of respond back and forth to that information. At the end, we have, and let me just check really quick, Cindy, do we have surveys this month? Yes. Okay, so we are going to ask you, we didn't prime you for this one, is towards the very end. What we're going to say is just that we've got some parent surveys we need to do. And again, it's data we're collecting from the parents who are watching, is to remind folks to please at the very end is to jump in and do those surveys. Usually it's only 4 or 5 questions. It takes 2 minutes. The information is really helpful to us. And also for those that are on YouTube, you won't be able to do that. And for those that want to share this or let others know about it, it is archived on our Federation YouTube website. So you can either go directly into YouTube and do a search for Idaho Federation, or if you go to the Federation's webpage under Parent Education, we archive all of them. We have our full library of previous webinars, so the whole variety of topics. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to you again. Super important information, and appreciate your being here.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me. I'm happy to be here today to talk to you about what's a pretty important topic. I'm going to try to get to the questions, all the questions that were submitted ahead of time. So I think the bulk of them will be answered throughout the program today for the next hour, and then some will save to the end, and I'll leave some time to answer questions at the end as well. We're going to start out though just going through sort of defining the problem and talking about suicide in general. There will be a focus as we go throughout highlighting youth specific topics, but I do want everyone also to have a knowledge of suicide in general, to make sure that we're looking out for everyone near us, and not just youth, but everyone, because that's how we really prevent suicide. It's one-on-one. So I think we'll be going back and forth between the slides and me. And so really that first slide, it just talks about my experience. And if we go to the next one, we're going to talk just a little bit, setting the stage about defining the problem and really understanding that suicide is about unbearable emotional pain. It's really not about wanting to die for anyone. So it's about not having the skills to solve that sort of unbearable emotional misery that someone is in or someone perceives that they're in, which is what's important. It's also important to know that suicide doesn't know any bounds. It occurs both sexes, across socioeconomic status, all races. That said, certain groups have higher rates, and we'll talk just a little bit about that. We're going to talk just for a few minutes about statistics. Some of you wanted to know about statistics. So the first slide on statistics shows the US compared to Idaho. So what you have there is a list of the number of deaths across the United States in 2017, which is the latest year we have data for. And then the number of deaths in Idaho, and you can see that we had more than one a day suicides, and that's all ages, that's total suicides in 2017. But what's most important to look at there to really understand what's going on in Idaho is the rate. That's that number at the bottom in green there. Suicide rates are measured this way. It's number of suicide deaths per 100,000 population. So that's what those numbers represent. So that you can see that in the US in 2017, there were 14.5 suicide deaths for every 100,000 population. And in Idaho, we were just about at 23 deaths per 100,000 population. So Idaho has a higher suicide rate than the national average, and Idaho always has a higher suicide rate than the national average. And on the next slide, you can see where we rank. So this is the top 12 states in terms of suicide rankings. And you can see that Idaho is 5th in the nation for number of suicides per capita there. But you can also see something, several of those states are highlighted in green, and you can see that most of those states are in the Mountain West. And actually, when we look at the rates year after year after year, it's the Mountain West that continually has the highest suicide rate. So Idaho is not unlike its neighbors in this. Most of the states around us are in the top 10, sometimes in the top 5. Idaho is typically always in the top 10. We've been maybe 11th about 3 times in the last 5 or 6 decades. But really, for the most part, states in the top 10 or top 15 sort of just trade places each year. So what's going on in Idaho and the Mountain West? There are really 3 things that lead to higher rates in Idaho and in states like Idaho. And so the first one of those is really has to do with lack of access to mental health care. And it's not just about lack of access to mental health care. It's about lack of access to health care that's affordable, that's effective. That is, the mental health clinician really knows how to arrest suicidality and manage it for someone. And that's geographically accessible for our more rural areas. So really all of those things have to come together to have proper access to mental health care. Idaho, its rural nature and the amount of money it spends on community mental health puts us sort of in the bottom when it comes to access to mental health care. But there are a lot of other states that are sort of in the bottom too most of the time, some of the southern states, and they never have the highest suicide rates. So we know that it has to do with more than just lack of access to proper mental health care. And these are the things where we start to understand why we continue to have higher rates in the West. So the next thing is really related to stigma. So in Idaho and in states like Idaho, we have a culture of rugged individualism, which is not necessarily a bad thing. I mean, it's what made people go west to begin with, but that culture also doesn't tend to lend itself to help seeking very well. And so that can continue the stigma if people feel that it's a sign of weakness to reach out for help. But the truth is we all reach out for help when we need it. It's very rare that people get through rough times or crises without turning to friends or family members, and of course, sometimes professionals to help us through that. So that stigma and that culture sort of flies in the face of being willing to reach out for help and admitting vulnerability. And then the last thing really has to do with just easy access to the most lethal means. There's a very, very well proven correlation between the states with the highest suicide rates and the states with the highest percentage of gun owning households. So this is one of those things that the jury's not out on anymore. We know that if there's more availability to guns, there's just more gun death. And that's true and well proven. And I promise that I'm not going to share anything with you this morning that isn't well proven. This topic is sort of too important for us to discuss things that maybe just one study showed, or people think is just common sense about this, because there are a lot of things we believe about suicide that really aren't true. So we're going to cover some of that in a few minutes as well. But this is one of these, and it's really related just about having easy access to the most lethal means. Further on that point, just a little more stats about firearm deaths in Idaho. We saw that in 2017, if we look at all of the firearm deaths in Idaho, we see that 87% of them were suicides. And if we look at all the firearm deaths that were self-inflicted, 98% of them were suicides. So the self-inflicted only 2% then would have been accidents. So this is really just to show that our gun death problem in Idaho is a suicide problem, truly. Next, we're going to look at youth statistics just very briefly. And this is taken from the Youth Risk Behavior Survey. This is a survey that is done every 2 years by the State Department of Education. And actually, every state does this survey. And it's a survey that asks just high school students, it's self-reported, 9th to 12th graders. It asks them a bunch of questions about a whole host of risky behaviors. So there are questions on there asking them, they're all framed like in the last 12 months. So in the last 12 months, have you been bullied? Have you brought a weapon to school? Are you smoking? Those kinds of things. And there are several questions on there related to depression and suicide. And so what we know from the 2017 survey, and the 2019 one was just completed, that information won't be out for a few months though, is that 1 in 5 Idaho high school students reported seriously considering suicide. 1 in 5 also said that they'd made a plan, and 1 in 10 reported making an attempt. Now you might think, wow, that's a lot of kids. 1 in 10, I mean, that's 10% saying that they had made an attempt. So you might be thinking, well, is that really, were those really a whole 10%? Was that really an attempt? Would that meet the definition of an attempt? Probably not. But I'm going to tell you that when it comes to the teenage mind, the perception is what matters. And in fact, when you're talking about someone who's highly suicidal, it is their perception that matters, because it will be their perception that takes their life if it's someone that we end up losing. So whether these meet the definition of attempt or not, you have 1 in 10 Idaho high school students believing that they have made an attempt. So let's move on to talking about the suicidal mind. And I'm going to spend a little bit of time talking about a model here that helps explain what's in place for people who we actually lose to suicide. Because I think if you can understand what's in place for those who we actually lose, it provides a foundation for anything else we're going to talk about in terms of prevention, or intervening and talking with someone, or even postvention, that is helping people who have lost someone to suicide. So this model that we're going to discuss is by Dr. Thomas Joyner. He's an expert in suicidology. He's a professor at Florida State University, so he's a big football fan, of course. He runs a clinic for the highly suicidal there. He has spent his entire career researching and studying suicide. He's a loss survivor. He lost his own father to suicide. And for the purposes of what we're going to talk about today, he's the author of the 4 books that are listed there. Why People Die by Suicide provided absolutely groundbreaking work in the field of suicide prevention. And we're going to discuss that model as a foundation that I was talking about. Myths about suicide, we'll talk just a little bit about that, because some of the myths that we buy into, they interfere with our thoughts about our ability to intervene with people. So we'll talk a little bit about that. Lonely at the Top is called Lonely at the Top, the High Cost of Men's Success. So males die by suicide 3.4 to 1. to females in the United States. And this book talks about that and what we can do about it. And then the last book is equally or maybe even more groundbreaking than the first book. It's called The Perversion of Virtue, Understanding Murder Suicide. It's absolutely the resource for this topic if anyone is interested in that. So let's walk through the model. Dr. Joyner's model is called the Interpersonal Psychological Theory of Suicide. I don't expect you to remember that, but hopefully you can remember the elements of this because it really gives us a look into the mind of those who we actually lose to suicide. So a couple of things before I put the full model up here, a couple of things that I want you to think about. This model only applies to those who we've actually lost to suicide or those who've made a very serious attempt. That is those who have survived who really shouldn't have survived, people who jumped and survived, that kind of thing. This model, since it only applies to those people, it's important to understand that death by suicide is statistically rare. Thinking about it, not so rare. Even making a plan, like when we looked at the Idaho high school student stats, not so rare. But actually dying by suicide is statistically rare. And to explain that a little better, if you'll think about that classroom slide that we showed you just a minute ago, I showed you that when we were looking at Idaho high school students, so we'll just take Idaho high school students because we have data. When we looked at that, I showed you 1 in 5 had seriously considered suicide and 1 in 10 had said they made an attempt. That's over a 1-year period. So 1 in 5 considering it, 1 in 10 making an attempt. And we lose about 1 in every 8,000 to 9,000 Idaho high school students to suicide each year. So dying by suicide is very, very different than thinking about it, making a plan, or even making an attempt. It is statistically rare. And this model that I'm going to put up here will explain that rarity. So we want to keep rarity in mind and why it is that lots of people can be thinking about it or even making an attempt, but we don't lose them, thankfully. And then the other thing to keep in mind is that people who are highly suicidal, and since this model applies to those who we lost, they were highly suicidal, that is not a rational state of mind. So you will see that irrationality pop up as we walk through this model for a couple of minutes here. So Dr. Joyner's model has 3 elements, and he maintains that there are 3 things in place for people who we actually lose to suicide. 2 of those things fit under one category that lead to the desire for suicide. So 2 things relate to the desire for suicide, but to be able to do anything, humans have to not only want to do something, they also have to be capable of it. So that's the second piece of this, and something that hasn't been studied as well over the many centuries, actually, that suicide has been studied. So these first 2 things that can lead to desire for suicide, the first one is called perceived burdensomeness. And what that really means is that people perceive themselves to be a burden to those around them. And the word perceived there is very important because it is truly their own perception. If you ask the people around them whether they are a burden, the people around them would not say that they're a burden at all. But the person who we lose to suicide has come to believe, and they believe it wrongly, and they believe it irrationally. It's not correct. But they have come to believe that their death would be worth more than their life to the people around them. Again, it's not true. And if you ask the people around them, they wouldn't say so, but they truly believe that they would be doing people a favor. And it is a false perception. And that's one of these things we can help people work through. This is an opportunity to turn somebody away from suicidality. We help them understand that they are not a burden. The second thing that's in place for the desire for suicide is called failed belongingness. And this can be someone who, even from outside looking in, maybe seems like they're surrounded by friends and family members and supportive people all around them. But in their own minds, they are feeling disconnected from others, completely disconnected. Again, it's a perception thing. So when people feel like they are not connected to others, and when they feel their death would be worth more than their life to the people around them, and if they feel those situations won't change, that's hopelessness. And that leads to desire for suicide. still, arguably, a lot of people at really low points, and we're all going to have ups and downs in life. And that's another thing that can be hard for the young brain to understand. A part of it is their underdeveloped frontal lobe. And part of it is that young people just don't have enough life experience yet to know that tomorrow doesn't have to look like today, that next week can be better than this week. And so that's where this perception piece comes in. So we can't just want to do something to do something. We also have to be capable of doing it. And under the capability side, our most basic instinct as human creatures is self-preservation. In fact, all living creatures, our most basic instinct is to preserve ourselves for survival. That is, we are not hardwired for self-destruction. We are hardwired for self-preservation. And to be able to butt up against what is our most basic instinct as living creatures is a daunting thing. It is a difficult thing. Suicide is not simple. It's not easy to do. It requires energy, and it requires a fearlessness, but not fearlessness in the sense that suicide is somehow heroic or courageous. It's not either of those things. But it requires a fearlessness about physical pain, about injury, about death. And so really that has to be in place as well for someone to be able to die by suicide. So any good theory about suicide would have to account for the things we know to be true about it. And we know that certain groups have higher suicide rates. Doctors, veterinarians, dentists, prostitutes, veterans, all those groups do. And you might think, well, what do they have in common? Well, since we're not born with the ability to harm ourselves, that's not natural. A person has to habituate to the idea of physical pain or injury or death. And of course, habituate's just a big word for getting used to something. But someone can habituate to the idea of physical pain either by experiencing it, certainly, or by witnessing it, doctors, dentists. So that getting used to the idea of physical pain has to be in combination with the two things that lead for desire to suicide. So really only where those three things overlap in the middle there, only where those three things overlap, you actually have a death or a very near lethal attempt for suicide. So you might say, well, what about all the other risk factors there are for suicide, right? What about drug and alcohol abuse? What about family history? What about ruralness? And these things are all important, but they fit over into what researchers call distal factors. You can see that over at the side there. And that is just to say that risk factors can add up in such a way that they will lead to those three things in those circles before there's a death to suicide. That's the funnel through which those risk factors have to go before we will lose someone. So the other thing that's important about risk factors is that risk factors are not predictive of suicide. And the reason they're not predictive is because, for example, you could have someone with a great number of risk factors. We could be talking about someone who is, as an example, homeless, maybe with an abuse problem, who doesn't have family members. And that person may never have thought of suicide because we don't know what his protective factors are. We don't know what his resilience is like. So people with high levels of resilience can make it through very difficult times. And most people actually do make it through very difficult times. And we do it with help and with resilience. But risk factors are not necessarily predictive. That's why we talk about warning signs. And we'll talk about warning signs in just a few moments. Risk factors are those things that can add up over time that obviously increase risk for all kinds of behaviors, and some of them related to suicide. Warning signs are signs that somebody is actively thinking about suicide, making a plan, planning to make an attempt. Those are warning signs, and that's how those two things differ. So this model, some of the questions that I get readily about it, and so I'm going to go ahead and address those because they're primarily related to youth, have to do with how someone, especially someone young, could habituate to the idea of physical pain. And of course, there's lots of ways to habituate to physical pain. But when we see these young people who we've lost and we think, gosh, they didn't play sports where they had a bunch of injuries. They weren't victims of abuse. They didn't witness abuse or a bunch of pain. Like they weren't involved in self-harm. They weren't covered in tattoos and piercing, things that can cause physical pain. How in the world could we have possibly lost them? And in those cases, we almost always find a previous attempt. So a person can habituate to the idea not just of death, but to the idea of their own death pretty quickly through a previous attempt. And we'll talk more about attempts in a little bit. The other question I get asked a lot about is self-harm. And self-harming behaviors are very, very rarely, about only 4% of the time, they're very rarely about suicide. They're for lots of other reasons that good mental health clinicians can talk to you about. And one of the main things that we hear from young people, and self-harm is primarily a function of youth, not entirely, but mostly youth. What we hear from young people is that they are engaging in physical pain to keep their mind off their emotional pain, which I think should tell us all something about the severity of emotional pain. And in fact, we don't even need that to tell us about the severity of emotional pain, because we have the brain research that tells us that our pain centers light up more from emotional pain than they do from physical pain. So that said, even though engaging in self-harm isn't typically 96% of the time, it's not about suicide at all. That said, people who have self-harmed have habituated to the idea of physical pain. So if you have a whole group of kids who come to feel perceived burdensomeness and failed belongingness, those who have engaged in self-harm will be at slightly higher risk because they have habituated to some degree. Have they habituated enough to enact lethal self-harm? Well, no, not most of them. Of course not. But it does increase their risk. So I hope that makes sense. And the other thing I wanted to mention is that typically people don't habituate to the idea of physical pain or self-violence to the level that's required for lethal self-harm through a video game or a screen or violent video games. I'm not a fan of violent video games. I have 2 teenage boys. You can ask them. But someone there are other things, and there are lots of reasons why not to do violent video games, but habituating to physical pain to the level it takes to enact lethal self-harm, that's usually something that's happening in real life. And we know that kids as young as age 3 are able to well distinguish between what's pretend on a screen and what's going on in real life. So don't be overly worried about those violent video games. Screen time, that's another issue. Let's move on to a few little true and false questions, and let's tackle just myths for a few moments. This first one says, asking someone about suicide might plant the seed or increase risk. I know that most people know now that is completely false. This is another one that the jury's not out on. Bringing it up is never going to plant the seed in somebody's head. Instead, you're usually met with relief, particularly if you're talking to someone who has been thinking about it. So it can even be brought up with kids, absolutely. Certainly age 11 and above. Younger than that, you want to be able to put things differently, and I would consult a mental health clinician if you're concerned about a child who's younger than that. But you can ask the question to anyone, and we know that when we lose someone, there are warning signs really about 100% of the time. Now, that doesn't mean that they're always easy to see, and some people are really good at hiding their warning signs, so it can be difficult. Or we may see things and not know that they're a warning sign. But we know that they're there. And 70% of the time, and I'm talking about 70% of people we've actually lost, 70% of the time, those warning signs were actual verbal statements that people made to people. And the average number of times that 70% made comments to those around them were about 4 to 5 times. So that's why if you're the one who is finally brave enough to ask them if they've been thinking about suicide, you're typically met with relief because most people have been trying to say something. So we know that it doesn't plant the seed, and I want to encourage you to be willing to ask the question. And we'll talk in just a few minutes about how to ask the question. That next one says more women attempt suicide than men. That's true. I told you men die by suicide. more frequently than women. That's true. But women make suicide attempts more often than men, 3 to 1. Excuse me. So what that's about really has to do with that men use more lethal means. That said, more women are using firearms. So we've seen the statistics change just a little bit, but we still lose more men than women. That next one says suicides increase over the winter holidays. While that's a very, very common belief, it's completely false. December is the lowest month for completed suicides. I know that when I talk to people who take calls like law enforcement or hotline or other crisis workers, that they say they see increases over the holidays or over the winter time. But those people are reaching out. Those are calls. I'm talking about actual suicides. So we do see suicides peak, and they peak the same time of year, almost every year, almost everywhere on the planet. And I bring this up so that we can talk about another really important topic. So they increase in late spring. May is typically the highest month for suicides, or June in there. It's usually very late spring, maybe early summer. And that's why we see them increase. And that's true all over. So if you're geographically minded, it means that in the Southern Hemisphere, they peak around November or so, and they do. So it's late spring. And if you'll remember, I talked about this not being a simple act or an easy act, but to die by suicide is daunting. It requires someone to butt up against their most basic instinct for survival, self-preservation. And that requires a certain amount of energy. So what we know is that people's energy is not all that high in the wintertime. When we think about how excited we might be about starting a new exercise program about, Thanksgiving time, we can sort of understand that quite simply our energy and our biorhythms go down in the winter. And while people might be feeling really low, because this requires a certain amount of energy, we tend to see suicides go up in the spring. Our biorhythms go up. Our energy goes up in the spring. And it's something that's true, like I said, almost every year all over the planet. So it's got to be something that's pretty innate to us as humans. And it is. And the reason I bring this up entirely is because if we take a smaller example that relates to a similar thing, some of our absolute highest rates of suicide are among those who have just been released from inpatient care. So when life has ups and downs kind of thing, when people are at their lowest low, when they're at the bottom of a dip, just when they start to get better, maybe they get on a new medicine, maybe they've had some outpatient care, maybe they've had inpatient care. When we lose them to suicide, we lose people just as they start to get better, as they start to climb out. That is, in some cases, they may be having a little more energy because they've gotten a little bit better, but they are not completely out of the woods in terms of their suicidality. And that is the most dangerous time. I mean, we do lose some people right at the very bottom of the what they're experiencing. But by and large, we lose people just as they're coming out of it. Now, for those released to inpatient care, sometimes they really aren't feeling any better after they're released. But instead, there are many other factors there, like being released and told that they should be better and they don't feel any better at all. Sometimes people are released into the same situation that sort of helped get them in there to begin with. So there are lots of factors involved. Nothing about suicide is there one answer or one point to make about it. It is multifaceted, but there are some simple things that we can do to help prevent it. And that's how we're going to end our talk today. So the reason I point that out is to impress upon you the importance of follow-up. If someone has just gotten treatment for suicidality, if they've just gotten on a good antidepressant, please don't blame the antidepressant. Not that there aren't some problems with some meds, don't misunderstand me there, but by and large, antidepressants are a good thing for most people who take them. So after somebody's gotten treatment or right after they've been released, follow-up is absolutely critical. If you're a clinician, that's probably the number one most preventive thing you can do is follow up after the beginning of treatment or release from inpatient. And as parents, we just need to be extraordinarily mindful when a child is going through treatment and if they've been suicidal, when they start to feel a little bit better, and keep a close eye. So follow up. That's kind of my point with that one. The fourth one says very young children complete suicide. That is true. It's very rare. It's quite rare that we see someone under the age of 10. And I think in Idaho, we have someone that young really only about every 6 or 7 years do we lose someone that young. But it does happen. So I just want us to be aware that this isn't something that just starts in middle school for all kids. The next one says suicide is often done on a whim. That is false entirely. No one just sees a weapon or something like that or a means and decides that they're suicidal. There's usually always a plan in place of some kind. That plan can be over a short period of time, but typically it's over a little bit longer. Even the studies that have been done on people who've made serious attempts and they say, oh, I just only thought about it a minute. Well, maybe that day they only thought it about a minute, but when you get into the stories behind them, they've all had suicide ideation for a while. Even though it's not done on a whim, that doesn't mean that impulsivity doesn't play a role. And so here's where the teenage brain comes in. And I imagine most of you listening have some experience with the fact that the teenage brain doesn't work like the adult brain. And that's true. And I don't mean to be disrespectful of those young brains because they can certainly do things that our brains can't do anymore. But that frontal lobe is not developed until at least age 25. And now the latest research is showing it may be 30 for males. I'm sorry, guys. It's not me, it's the research, I swear. So we need to consider, because that frontal lobe, that's where judgment is, that's where impulse control is, and that's what I'm talking about here. So we do need to keep in mind, particularly if there are weapons in the house, that the teenage brain and the young adult brain is more impulsive than mature adult brain. And added to what we were talking about earlier, that they just don't have enough life experience to know that tomorrow doesn't have to look like today, and today's crisis might go on forever and ever and ever. That combined with the impulsive brain was a kid who is highly suicidal. If there is a weapon in the house, that is the most dangerous combination. And of course, there are other means. That's just the most lethal, especially with someone who's impulsive. So that's something to keep in mind for sure. That next one says restricting access to lethal means is a critical prevention method. That is absolutely true. It's true in the big picture. So countries who have reduced access to the means used most often have seen their suicide rates go down and stay low. It's also true on the individual level. Anything we can do to separate somebody from the idea of how they think they're going to do it can make a difference. And it really has to do with just putting time and space between thought and action. And that's what we're trying to do. And when people do that, it saves lives every day. And lack of doing that takes lives every day. So as an example, I think most people know who Halle Berry is, the actress. She had a suicide attempt, and she did it in the car with the hose. And she reports that as she was sitting there thinking about it, she realized after a minute or so, all her mother had sacrificed so that she could have a better life. And she turned off the car. And she had a few minutes to think about it because as I showed you in that model, this is not a rational place for the brain to be. It's very narrow thinking. It's like being in a dark room for people, and they don't see any other way out except suicide. But that's because their brain has that very narrow thinking at that moment. And so almost anything we can do to sort of eke out the blinders that somebody has on when they're suicidal, just even a little bit, that's what happened for Halle Berry. She did it for herself. Anything we can do to eke that out, people might have a thought about doing something to help themselves. So when we put time and space, even a cheapy gun lock, when we put time and space between their suicidal thoughts and their action, we can save lives. People have 2 to 3 thoughts per second. So if it even takes somebody a minute to go find a gun lock or go find where the means that they have decided on have been locked away, even in that minute, that's hundreds of thoughts that somebody can have. And so if even one of those thoughts is about calling the hotline or reaching out to someone for help, or what Halle Berry did in that moment is she remembered her belongingness to her mother. And that's what shifted those blinders for her. So that's what we're trying to do with means restriction. And we know that it works. We know that it works. That last one says most suicidal people are ambivalent about it, like maybe yes, maybe no. And that is true. It's not only true, but the experts in this field say that I really should add the word highly in front of ambivalent. And that is because what's going on for most people who are suicidal is that they have things that are pulling them toward death and pulling them toward life. It's sort of like a tug of war. And so what you've got pulling people toward death are typically their problems, and also that narrow thinking where they think suicide is the only answer. When we know that there are healthy coping mechanisms that help get us through difficult times, they can't see those healthy coping mechanisms. So that narrow thinking and their problems tend to pull them one direction. And the other direction is what's pulling them there is, number one, our most basic instinct for life. And secondly, usually some reasons for living. Their brains just don't see that right now, but that's something that we can help them see. And we can do it with some of the ways that were depicted on that model. That perceived burdensomeness that I talked about, well, the opposite of perceived burdensomeness is feeling capable, productive, helpful. And the opposite of failed belongingness is just feeling belonging, feeling connected to somebody. And that's something that we can do. Even if we just ask someone if they're thinking of suicide, we've created that connection with them. Because since this isn't about death, since it's about emotional suffering, when you ask someone if they're considering suicide, it's an immediate recognition of the depth of their emotional suffering. And you create that sense of belongingness, just connection in that moment. Doesn't mean that somebody may not need to see a counselor or have ongoing treatment, but in that moment, they just need you. So that struggle, and anything we can do to sort of tip that tug of war in one direction and tug it towards life, just tip it just a little bit. Anything we can do, reason for living, anything that's hopeful, we can save people in those moments when we do that. So let's get into a little more depth about what we can do. Number one, we can look for warning signs. And so if you Google warning signs, the internet now has something like 3,000 warning signs for suicide. There are not 3,000 warning signs for suicide. So I've tried to help you out a little bit with this slide, putting some of these in blue. Attempts are really important, and attempts show up both on the risk factor and on the warning sign list because they're that important. If someone has a previous attempt, it's critical to know about that. And when they see a clinician, to let the clinician know that they've had a previous attempt. When we look at those we've actually lost, those 4 things in blue tend to float to the top over and over and over again for the people who we've lost. So certainly talking about it, threatening, that goes without saying. Isolation and withdrawal are very important. It's a very high warning sign, just because people who feel disconnected from others can start to self-isolate, and it sort of becomes this self-perpetuating thing. Agitation and sleeplessness. Suicide is fluid, suicidality. So someone can be highly suicidal, as an example, maybe at night when they're at home, and then, they sort of hold it together the next day to go to school or to go to work or whatever. And then the next night when they're at home, they're suicidal again. So the suicidality can be high and low over a number of days. And sometimes when people are experiencing that, they're also not getting any sleep. Because if you're considering doing something that's going to butt up against your basic instinct for survival, you can become physically agitated. Your adrenaline goes up, and you can actually see it in somebody that they are physically agitated, or you can hear it in their voice if you're talking to them. That combined with sleeplessness is a very high warning sign, and so are nightmares. And let me be clear that our highest rates of suicide are not among youth at all. I showed you that our rates overall in the state were about 23 per 100,000, and school-age youth usually have a rate around 7 per 100,000. So I mention that because when it comes to the warning sign of nightmares, and we're talking about people who we've lost, we need to keep in mind that the vast majority of people we lose are adults. Nightmares are not uncommon for small kids. It's a very natural part of the brain development, from what I understand. Can you tell I'm not a brain scientist? But it's common for young kids, but by the time kids get to high school, we start to grow out of having nightmares as a natural part of development. And so the typical adult has about 1 nightmare a year. So adults with higher rates of nightmares, that can be a warning sign. The good news about nightmares is there's really excellent treatments for nightmares now. So that's a good thing. Just a couple other slides with more warning signs on them. I'm not in the habit of reading my slides, so I'll just let you sort of look through those. That first one, I'll just point out the one about recent loss. If the suicidal person, if their recent loss was the person they talked to, was sort of their rock, that can be particularly problematic. The next slide, I'll just mention that last one down on the bottom there, because typically when we think about depression, we think of sad, hopeless, lonely, those kind of things. We think of what one of my colleagues used to say, Eeyore. And some people look like that, but males may not always look like that when they're depressed, particularly young males. And it may look like this unexplained or increases in anger, aggression, and irritability. And when we see that type of behavior, depression screening isn't necessarily what comes to our mind because we're thinking more of Eeyore. So keep that in mind. Moving on, I mentioned that 70% of the time, the warning signs were actual verbal statements. So this next slide shows that sometimes those verbal statements are very direct statements, and you can tell they're related to suicide. That last one, just fill in the blank with whatever somebody is saying. If this doesn't happen, or if this does happen, then I'll kill myself. But they're not always direct. Sometimes they're indirect. So that next one gives you an idea of what more indirect ones look like. If we can move forward a slide. And these you probably will hear more often, the indirect ones. My family would be better off without me. There's that perceived burdensomeness. You won't have to worry about me any longer. That's also perceived burdensomeness. No one would care anyway. I'm not connected to anyone who would care. That's that failed belongingness. So you can see the model coming out even in these indirect signs. So let's talk about how to intervene with somebody next. Excuse me. And you want to ask directly. So you've got to ask someone if they're thinking of suicide or if they're thinking of killing themselves. And if that seems too abrupt for you, a less direct way that can still get you where you need to go pretty quickly is that second one, where you fill in the blank with whatever warning sign you're seeing or you've heard about or somebody's reported to you. So it goes like, you seem to be really down and you said you haven't been sleeping. Sometimes when people are that down and they haven't been sleeping, they're thinking about suicide or you. I've noticed that you're really X and Y. Sometimes when people are X and Y, they're thinking about killing themselves. Are you? So you set the stage in the beginning with a statement that will lead you toward belongingness. I've noticed something about you, right? And then you very quickly get to the question you need to ask. There are some ways not to ask. So this first one, you cannot ask people if they're thinking of hurting themselves or harming themselves. They will say, oh no, in their brains and their irrational thinking, I'm not going to hurt myself, I'm going to kill myself, it won't hurt. And that happens not infrequently. So unless you're worried about self-harm, if you're truly worried about suicide, you must use the words suicide, or are you thinking about killing yourself? Hurting or harming, people can slip through the cracks. So not that way. The second way up there, you're not suicidal, are you? That's kind of judgmental. It says, please say no, because this topic scares me. So not that way. And then the last one is, we don't want to label anybody as crazy or stupid or whatever. They're really going to open up and talk to you if you label them that way. So not those ways. Just remember that you seem to be this and this, and sometimes when people are this and this, they're thinking of killing themselves or they're thinking of suicide or you. So I repeated that several times because I want to try to help you remember it. The next thing you want to do is listen well. And I'm going to tell you that, and this is really hard for us as parents. Oh, I know how hard this is as parents, but not to go into problem solving mode, because they're going to discuss their problems with you. Typically, if you ask someone and they admit they're suicidal, you're going to hear about their problems. And so our brains naturally, especially as parents, want to problem solve. And I'm going to tell you, their brains are not in problem solving mode to begin with. And if we're busy problem solving in our own minds, that's something we do in our own brains. We're not really listening. So you want to stick with reflective listening. And some of you will probably know what that is, but it's just reflecting back what you're hearing from them emotionally. And I want to let you know, as a start of my list for simple things that make a big difference, reflective listening can be really simple. It can be, gosh, that sounds hard. Sounds like you're really overwhelmed. I think you're telling me you're feeling stressed out. Gosh, it sounds like you're really down. Or simply, I'm so sorry you're going through that. I know that sounds too simple. I know we feel as parents we've got to solve it for them, but in those moments, all we need is reflective listening. We can problem solve later if we find we need to call the hotline or something like that. But initially, you've got to stick to that reflective listening so you can sort of hear how bad it really is, or maybe it's not as bad as you think it is, but you won't know unless you're doing that reflective listening with them. Sometimes listening is all that's needed. You've created that belongingness for them, and that can make a difference. The next thing you want to do is instill hope. And I'm going to tell you that there are very simple statements. There's some examples for you that instill hope. We statements are particularly good because that's more than one. So that's belongingness. I'm going to beat this belongingness horse here. We'll get through this. Let's call the hotline. Let's go talk to someone else. They know they're not in it alone. So it's belongingness. If you can't remember any of the rest of these, just remember, I care if you live. Because you do, no matter who you're talking to. I care if you live. So there's that one. You want, of course, then get help. This first slide is just meant for getting help generically, whoever you're talking to, not specifically youth. And sometimes you might be talking to an adult. So if they're at risk, you want to get to a crisis center, mental health provider. If they're an adult, you can't force them to do these things. So at the very least, you want a commitment that they're going to get help, or you want to help them make arrangements to get help. And if someone admits they're suicidal, they can't be left alone. And even if it's someone maybe you're not very close to, but you need to pass them off to a family member if someone's closer, they need to know that they're suicidal, and they need to know that they can't be left alone until they get some professional help. You also have the hotline available to you. There's the 1-800-273-TALK. That's the national number, and that routes the caller to the crisis center nearest the area code that they're calling from. So keep in mind that if you're living in Idaho and you have an Oregon phone or a Utah phone or something like that, if a person calls from that phone, they'll get the crisis center in Utah or Oregon at the 1-800-273-TALK. They're still going to get someone who can help for sure. But it might be better to call the Idaho line just because they have closer tabs on all the resources in Idaho for people to get to. So that's why that 208 number, partially why that was created, 208-398-HELP. Again, that's 208-398-HELP. HELP is 4357. And so you'll always get the Idaho hotline if you call that. Plus you can text that number 3 to midnight, Monday through Friday. They will soon be increasing that to something close to 24/7, the text. Right now, if you text in the hours where text is not available, it comes right back letting you know what your other options are. There's a national text line and somebody can always call. If the person's 18 or older, I highly recommend going to one of the local crisis centers. They can get a medical and mental health assessment there. Someone can spend the night if they need to. So look up your local crisis centers. Getting mental health help. And then if you go through this with someone, please make sure to check in with how that made you feel. And practice self-care yourself and make sure that you've got someone to talk to. All right, got about 10 minutes. We're going to talk about other things you can do to keep youth safe. And then hopefully we'll have time for a few questions. Someone asked about support networks for youth. That, of course, includes parents or guardians. And things you can do there are meals together. Probably most of you know that having so many meals together reduces risky behaviors for youth, and that's true. But there's also a threshold, and it's 4 nights a week. So if you can even manage dinner 4 nights a week, that's when we see the great reductions in all kinds of risky behaviors. If someone is highly suicidal, the more people around them that know that they're suicidal, the more protected they are. Don't be afraid to engage other family members. Talk to their closest friends, and hopefully, as a parent, you have a relationship with their closest friends or the parents of their closest friends. Please be sure that if you are concerned about your child, that your school counselor knows and that your student is on their radar for the school counselor. And also mental health providers when they're needed. I want to say one thing more on the slide about restricting access to lethal means, because if we think that our guns are locked up and the kids don't know where the keys are, that's not always the case. So I'm going to tell you that gun locks are a good idea, that locking ammunition separately from guns is a good idea. But truly, if you know that someone in your household is highly suicidal, getting the guns out of the house temporarily is the safest thing you can do. I know just from the nature of my work, a lot of people who've lost people and people who've lost children. And I know a lot of families who just wish they'd gotten the guns out of the house. And I don't want to know any more of those families. But again, regardless of the type of means, and it's perfectly safe to ask someone about their means. So I wanted to mention that. Safety plans are really important. And that's that next slide. I put a picture on there of what the little pocket safety plans look like that you can get from the Department of Health and Welfare. So if you go to Health Tools there, healthtools.dhw.idaho.gov, and I'll make sure that the folks here know how to connect you with that. You can get these safety plans, and they're highly effective. It helps people, it reminds them of what their healthy coping mechanisms are, and that's not what always people will think to turn to. Another thing is having a little hope box. That is a little box that people can turn to when they can't remember their healthy coping mechanisms and they might turn to a risky behavior. The box is full of things that are reminders of connection for them, of things, their hobbies, things that make them feel good, that help them feel better. And there's also a virtual hope box that you can download as an app on a phone, or somebody can just take pictures of the things that give them hope and remind them of their healthy coping mechanisms. And that's a good sort of backup safety plan for people as well. I'm going to skip through because we're slow on time. Go ahead and skip through to the large one that says 17% at the top right there. So I was asked to talk about messaging a little bit. And so I wanted to mention that we need to be sure that we're engaging in what's called positive opposites. So we know that in this case, 17% of high schoolers smoke, but what the truth is that 83% don't. So we need to be talking with people, and especially with kids, about what the norm is. And the norm is that most people don't die by suicide. 4 out of 5 high schoolers aren't thinking about it. 9 out of 10 aren't making an attempt. And we've got to talk to our kids more and more and more about what's not happening. And the norm is that people who become suicidal get better. Recovery is the norm. And I'm being signaled
so I'm
here.
interjecting. This is an important topic. So we are not on like an hour we have to cut off. So I'm more concerned that you cover material
Okay.
to the degree that you feel like you got the message across, then hit my clock.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you. So this is the importance of messaging, because I think what we don't talk about enough with people who are suicidal is that recovery really is the norm. We talk to them about what their risk factors are. And one thing we need to change, I think, in our narrative at home, but especially in schools, is that if we want our kids to stop being at risk for everything, we need to stop telling them how at risk they are for everything and start talking to them about what the norm is, as the example with smoking here. So some of the ways that we can do that are talking to them about their strengths. So this is the Sources of Strength Wheel. It's one program that's available for schools. And what I love about it is that it's upstream, because if we're ever truly going to make a difference for youth and as they become adults, if we're ever going to make a true difference to reduce suicide over the lifespan, we've got to stop kids before they become suicidal, or we'll be intervening with people forever. And of course, we need to continue to intervene with people who are at risk. Absolutely. I'm not saying that we don't, but we additionally need to move upstream and make sure that young people know what their strengths are before they ever become suicidal. So the Sources of Strength Wheel are 8 strengths that really all of us, not just kids, rely on to get through difficult times. We know that it takes at least 3 of the things on that wheel to get through truly traumatic or difficult times or times of crises. And typically, not everybody is strong in all 8 of those at once, or if you are, really good for you. But that's not the way life tends to be, right? So we might be stronger in family support now, and 10 years from now, it may not look like that. But people tend to usually at least have 3 of these. And when we work with kids on this, no kid leaves without identifying a strength that they have to turn to. So you can see that most of those have to do with people, family support, positive friends. It's really important that young people understand the difference between their negative friends and their positive friends. And we start out by asking kids what makes a negative friend, or if they've ever had a negative friend. And most of them have had a negative friend. And so if they can identify that, that gets their brain churning about, oh, what makes that person negative and what makes these friends positive? And one little litmus test I tell my kids is when you're done interacting with that person, do you feel better or worse? Primarily about yourself. Do you feel better about yourself or worse about yourself? And it doesn't mean that you can't have difficult discussion with your good friends and you might feel down or bad for them. That's natural. But in general, your positive friends shouldn't make you feel bad about yourself. So mentors, again, that's a personal connection. And a lot of people, especially older people who become suicidal, may feel like they have no friends or family left. And sometimes we can find somebody in their lives who's a mentor, who they don't consider a family member or a friend, but there's somebody else there who's looking out for them, maybe providing them with some guidance or looking out for their best interests. And we label them as a mentor. And we know we all do better. It's not just for kids. We all do better as adults if we keep mentors in our lives. So mentors are very important. Healthy activities, I want you to think about those as broadly as possible, because when we say healthy activities, people tend to think of physical activities. And certainly those are great. That gets the endorphins going. It gets people moving. If they're involved in outdoor or physical activities with other people, it can create a sense of belongingness. Being involved in team sports can be very protective as long as those team sports are inclusive and not exclusive of anyone. But we need to keep in mind that healthy activities don't have to look like that. Some people and some young people like to draw, paint, play an instrument, listen to their music, hang out with their pets. Maybe they are in the acting class. Maybe they just like to sing in the shower. All of these, we need to consider everything that is a healthy activity. So we can get any child to identify with something that they like to do. Generosity is really important. We don't tend to think about the things that we do or that are generous, but even smiling at somebody is generous. You both get a little hit of dopamine or endorphins or something when you smile at somebody and they smile back. It's a good thing. And it's a generous thing. Holding the door open for somebody, right? It doesn't all have to be volunteerism, but volunteerism is really important and good for our health as well. When we do something generous, we find that we tend to get more out of that than the person we're doing something for. The most important thing about generosity is that it flies in the face of perceived burdensomeness, that element that has to be there for completed suicide. So if you can point out to somebody something that they do that's generous, point out to them how helpful that is. And I don't mean in a fake kind of way. Genuinely, let them know how generous that is. I have in my own experience that my son mows a lawn for a very difficult person. And I remind him quite frequently that listening to that person's stories, as difficult as it is a kindness. It's a generosity that he's doing. And it makes him feel like he's giving a gift. It makes him feel good about himself. So generosity, spirituality, we want to define really broadly too, because for some people that might be their religion, but we just ask people what feeds their spirit, because most people can relate to that. So for there are other people, it might be mindfulness or walking out in nature, that kind of thing. Medical access and mental health care access, those are strengths. Those are things that we don't think about readily as strengths. But the only time I haven't had health insurance in my life, I had appendicitis. So I've learned that having access to mental health, if you have insurance, that's a strength. And this means you have access to care. So we need to look at those things as strengths as well. And most importantly, we need to start looking at the mental health and the medical piece as the same. We are in desperate need of mental health parity in this country. A brain is just another part of the body, and we need to care for it as much as we do the body, or maybe even more so. We know that if we don't handle our emotional things, eventually through the hormones that are released by our brain, it will manifest physically and it will turn into a physical problem. So mental health care is so important. Our pain center registers mental health pain, as I mentioned before, just like it does physical pain, and it's real. It's real to our bodies and to our brains. So it's important that we look at parity. And the reason I spent a few minutes going through all of those strengths is because these aren't just strengths that we can learn to rely on and that we have. These are all code for healthy coping mechanism. These are all code for reasons for living, for people who become suicidal. So it's important that we be well versed with the things that people might have in their lives. We always start out the conversation with just that reflective listening, but as we move further and as we're moving upstream with our kids before they become suicidal, let's make sure they're able to identify what their strengths are. because we really don't spend our time there. We spend our time telling them about all the horrors they might encounter. And we did have one case. I'll just give you one quick example of a conducting this training in a juvenile justice center. And after we had done about a 2-hour mini training on this, one of the young men who had been in there for a few years, who was about to get out, stood up and said to his entire group, and he was pretty indignant too. He said, why did no one ever tell us that we have these strengths? Why don't adults tell us that we have these strengths? This was news to him. And he was turning 18 and getting out. And he added that he thought maybe he could make it based on the things that he had identified. So important that we spend some time upstream. A couple other things just to mention really quick. I mentioned already volunteerism, which can be very important because it sort of gets us out of ourselves. And again, it flies in the face of perceived burdensomeness. And then also practicing gratitude. So there's something called the gratitude challenge, which is listing 3 different things you're grateful for every day for 21 days. And we know that when someone does that, it physically changes their brain because we've done the scientists have done the brain scans on it. And the reason it physically changes the brain is because our brains are naturally negative thinking. We actually have to work to make them positive thinking. And they're naturally negative thinking because it's protective. It goes back to our caveman days. But if you practice with people in gratitudes, it forces our brains to scan the day for the positive instead of the negative. Because it's easy to go home and think about the hassles and the stressors and the things we need to do tomorrow. But if we think of the things we're grateful for, it physically changes our brain and it changes the way we think, and it impacts our mental health and our physical health. So that's sort of an exciting thing to do. You can do it with your family. You can text each other your gratitudes each day. That way, if somebody forgets, somebody else remembers and it reminds you. So I encourage you to do that. I think that I've gotten to the majority of your questions with what we've covered, but there were a few questions that were left over that didn't sort of fit in. So I wanted to address these really quickly. I had one that's how do you tell the difference between normal teenage behavior and what isn't? Yeah, that's like the question. So that's challenging, but I want to say you've got to look at risky behaviors. A certain amount of secrecy in adolescence is expected, of course. Adolescents are going through that period of time where they're differentiating themselves from their parents or their guardians, right? They're looking to stand out, to be different, to not listen to what you say. They're going to be a little bit secretive. But I would say focus on risky behaviors, and some of that may include risky behaviors. Usually, most teens will experiment with some kind of risky behavior or another. But if those risky behaviors start to impact isolation, impact their relationship with their friends, impact their grades, impact their relationship with you in a significant way, that's when we need to start paying close attention. It may not mean that they're suicidal, but it's reason enough to check in if they're also all of a sudden isolating more, not hanging around the same friends, their grades take a drop. It's kind of like warning signs. You're looking for something that really doesn't look like them. And if it's related to risky behaviors and it's impacting their daily functioning and their daily relationships, that's when you really want to step in and see what's going on. Ask probing questions. Get them to mental health help if they need it. And if you see warning signs for suicide, don't be afraid to ask that question. That's a tough one. How do I keep my experience with depression, suicidal thoughts from coloring my ability to see or relate to my child's? This is a really personal question, and without sort of knowing more about the individual situation, it's kind of hard to answer. But I'm going to say that just it's okay for your child to know that you've had depression or that people do think about suicidality. We don't want to normalize suicide, but we do want to normalize that people sometimes do think about it. And people do have mental health disorders and people do have depression and they live healthy, productive lives. That's the other message. So while we have these things, we want to spend the majority of our time talking about how do we get through them? How do we function? How do we get better? What makes us healthy? What makes us productive? So it's fine to discuss those things with them and try to understand that, yes, their depression may not look like yours at all. That's very true. But I would pose this question to a mental health provider for something in a little more detail. Helping youth advocate for their peers through healthy conversations, suicide and self-harm. Yeah, it's really important to talk about suicide. And it's important to talk to youth about suicide, but we need to do it in the right ways. And as I mentioned before, we can't spend the majority of time talking about risk. It's fine for people to tell their stories, even as long as their stories is 10%, here's my sad story, and 90%, here's how I got better, here's who I turned to, here's what made me feel better, here's what I'm doing now to stay healthy. We really need to focus on what the norm is, and the norm is recovery. So we don't want young people acting as peer counselors for their friends. If they've got a friend who's suicidal, they must talk to a trusted adult. They must. If their friend broke their leg, they wouldn't try to set it themselves. They would get an adult involved. And someone who is in suicidal crisis is at more risk than somebody who's broken a leg. And there are professionals and adults who can help. So they need to look for warning signs in their friends. They need to be encouraging to them. And of course, they're going to talk to them. But if their friend is suicidal, or they know that they're the only one that knows that friend's had an attempt, that's a dangerous thing to be having a teenager be burdened with. So they really must get an adult involved. Even if it means that it might make their friend angry. Trust me, that anger is temporary. And we have situation after situation after situation where friends have come back weeks, months, sometimes even years later and said, you helped save my life. I was angry at you, but you helped save my life. So we need to make sure that young people know they have to reach out to a trusted adult. That's part of what that Sources of Strength program does that I mentioned earlier. So healthy conversations is focusing on that people get better and that we need to reach out to an adult. The other thing is how helping suicidal clients. I'm hoping that some of the things I covered here will help those of you who might be clinicians, but this was not the clinician training. This was more the parent training. So there is a clinician training though, and there are also resources also at Health Tools at Health and Welfare that are sort of the basics that you need to know as a clinician. I would also encourage you to attend training by Dr. David Rudd. Hopefully he'll be brought back to Idaho here soon, who actually can teach arresting suicidality in as little as 4 sessions with somebody. So as clinicians, really having training in arresting suicidality and understanding that suicidality has to be treated first and separately from a mental health disorder. Suicide is not a natural outgrowth from a mental health disorder, and it must be treated separately and first. So that is, if someone's suicidal, you can't simply go about treating the depression or the bipolar or whatever's there and hope that the suicidality goes away. Suicidality has to be treated separately, and then of course you're going to go on to treat whatever mental health condition is happening for them. So I'll give you those little tidbits for that, but truly there are a lot more resources for how to arrest suicidality in your clients. But I would focus on treating it first, separately, and focusing on resilience. And then there are a lot more tips and information for dealing with people who are deeply suicidal, or those who are sort of chronically suicidal. There are things we can do to get them out of that loop, and it's more than I can go into here, unfortunately. So I hope that touches on those questions just a little bit. And the last resources I just wanted to leave you with were survivor support groups. So there are 5 throughout the state. So Coeur d'Alene, Boise area, Meridian area, Twin Falls, Idaho Falls, all have lost survivor support groups. If you've lost someone to suicide, I'm truly sorry. It is a different kind of death. It's a different kind of grief. If you know someone who's lost someone, just be there for them, maybe refer them to a group. They can be incredibly healing to talk to other people who've gone through the same thing. And then the last resource there is just a reminder about the hotline and also their website, because they have a chat function as well on their website. And then for young people, to talk about what programs are available for young people in schools, contact the Idaho Liz Project at the website or the phone number that I've listed there. And at the very end, I have the email to contact me. Thank you for letting me go over. And I thank everybody for their kind attention today.
Yeah.
Other
Information.
questions?
So 3 pointer questions. One of them is it possible to get copies of your slides? Can we post this on the Federation
Sure.
website? And
for information, just not to use to train on your own, only because some of the slides don't belong to me. They belong to Dr. Joyner or Dr. Rudd or the other experts. But for reference, absolutely.
Okay, so if we, Cindy, put a big disclaimer on there as we do pin slides, Second thing, so do you do this talk, if someone wants to contact you with the contact information you gave,
Yeah, they
are
contact
you
me at that
doing
email.
presentations to groups of parents and community groups and things like that? If they're
Certainly.
interested.
Certainly.
Okay, 'cause I think to get that information out into the community as much as possible. And then I think just my own personal thing from my experience with my teenage daughter was I wish that I had had conversations with her ahead of time before she
Earlier.
lost friends from suicide. Because I think it's such a tough issue and kids don't know what to do with it when they have friends that are struggling. So to have been able to talk with her ahead of time about how important it is that she not hold that secret or not feel like she's the one that can help that person, but recognizing that helping is to talk to an adult. Because I do think the burden on our kids is within their peer groups is they're hearing this and they don't know what to do.
Right.
And that whole issue of not betraying their friend is so important. That I wish I had front loaded her with some of that information ahead of time. So that's my little tidbit. Because I feel like so many of our kids they're living in a world where it's not frequent, but it is a reality. And the conversations are there, even though they don't follow through, but they're having those conversations. So the more that we talk to our kids about it, in terms of their own mental wellness, but then also engaging with their other friends. And when do you bring adults in and when do you not carry that burden? So.
Absolutely. And it's being done in the schools that have that Sources of Strength program. That is what's being taught there. And there's about, I think by the end of this year, there's going to be over 100 schools in Idaho with it. But if you're interested in that, reach out to your school or reach out to the Idaho Lives Project. On their website is a list of all the schools that have it. And find out how that's going and how that's working in your school.
Okay. Thank you for coming.
Yes,
and I look forward to bringing you back again because it's some critical information and like there are other things you can talk on a broader level. So we'll give you opportunities to hit some of the other things that you had talked about, like social media. I think was one of the things that
that's a whole other thing. Murder suicide is completely different talk, and there are separate talks too for all different types of professionals. So law enforcement, clergy, foster parents. There are different trainings for each group.
Okay, very good. Thank you for joining us. We have another webinar coming up in August. Can't tell you exactly what it is or when it is, so we will get the information out to you. But enjoy the month of July and we'll catch up with you all again in a month. Thank you much.